Izuku Midoriya, aka Deku, is one of the most selfless and self-sacrificing heroes in modern anime. Deku truly wants to save everyone, even the worst criminals and villains. He has compassion for all of them, and he wants to give everyone a second chance. But what if I told you that there's a world in which Deku could have become a murderous villain? Someone willing to do whatever it takes to get his way. Someone determined to bend all of Japan to his will, and yet someone who is not actually that different from the Deku we know. No, I'm not talking about some bizarro Deku or like Deku's evil twin. In this video, I will show you how the Deku we already know could have become a villain if just a couple of changes had been made to the story. If that sounds like an interesting idea to you, then stick around until the end because this is going to be quite an adventure. And of course, leave a like and subscribe for more videos like this. Heads up, there will be spoilers in this video up to the UA Trader arc, so please proceed with caution. You have been warned. Now, it would be a lot easier to imagine Deku becoming a villain if we changed his entire childhood. So, for example, if he was taken in by All For One at the age of 5 instead of Tenko Shimura, and then basically brainwashed and groomed into becoming a villain. If all of that happened, we can certainly see how Deku could have become a dark and evil character. There's actually a theory out there that Shigaraki was born quirkless just like Deku. And that is why at the age of 5 he still didn't have a quirk, even though quirks are supposed to manifest by age 4. In chapter 235 we get Tenko Shimura's backstory, and we see that one day when he was 5 years old, little Tenko was dropped off at his home by a mysterious man. Apparently Tenko was out playing hero and he got into some trouble, but this man was kind enough to bring him back to his parents. This man shows up in only a single panel and we don't see his face, but we do see that he is a big guy who wears a suit and a fedora, which is most certainly in line with All For One's fashion sense and body type. In fact, in chapter 350, when All For One finds an injured Toya on Sekoto Peak, he is dressed in exactly the same way. I mean, this has to be him. And if it really was All For One himself who dropped Shigaraki off at home that day, then is it really a coincidence that Shigaraki manifested decay for the first time, like right after that? Of course not. This was All For One who dropped Shigaraki off at home, and he secretly transferred decay into him on that day. There are several reasons why he did this. He knew Tenko was Nana Shimura's grandson, and he wanted to get back at All Might and Gran Torino by messing with Nana's family. He also knew that he would one day need a new vessel, and finally, he knew that the perfect vessel to inherit many different quirks through the All For One quirk is someone who was born quirkless. We know this to be the case with One For All. Those who were born with a quirk and inherit One For All die young because their body burns out. But those who are born quirkless and then inherit One For All can live a full life, like All Might did. Since we know that the All For One and One For All quirks are connected, and actually one literally created the other, we can assume that the same is true for both quirks. But why am I telling you all this about Shigaraki? It's because I want to show you that Deku could easily have been in Shigaraki's place if All For One had chosen him as a potential vessel instead of Tenko Shimura. Deku was also a quirkless kid who desperately wanted to become a hero just like Tenko, and All For One could have transferred decay onto him. Then Deku might have accidentally activated it and killed his own family, and then All For One would have raised him to become a villain and his new vessel. This is certainly a scenario worth exploring. A world where Shigaraki may have been a hero who inherited One For All, and Deku may have been a villain who was raised by All For One and Ujiko. But a Deku who was brought up by All For One instead of his mom would be a completely different character than the Deku we know today. So while this is an interesting scenario to think about, in this video I want to focus on how the Deku we actually know could have taken a much darker turn at one specific point in the story. Deku could have eventually become a villain if the Paranormal Liberation War arc and the Battle of Jakku went differently in the manga, and if the final outcome was much worse for the heroes than it was in the original timeline. But first, let's look back a bit further. After the death of Sir Night-Eye and after Medio loses his quirk during the Shie Hasaikai arc, Deku feels terrible because he believes that he wasn't good enough to save everyone. He feels that he didn't do enough during the raid on Overhaul's headquarters. He feels that Midoriya did more than him, and that Midoriya deserves One for All more than he does. He even offers to transfer the quirk to Midoriya, but Midoriya refuses and encourages Deku to keep going in order to become the best hero he can be. From this incident, we can see how personally Deku takes it when someone dies or is injured on his watch. Of course, Deku wasn't really to blame for what happened. They were all heroes doing their best to fight a bunch of powerful villains on their home turf. And unfortunately, the heroes will sometimes suffer casualties. No matter how hard you try and how much you prepare, sometimes casualties are inevitable in such a high-risk line of work. We also saw that during the Battle of Jakku, Deku became severely injured in the fight against awakened Shigaraki, to the point that he couldn't even move his limbs anymore. He then screamed at himself to move and use Float and Black Whip and fight even though his limbs were busted. He yells out,
Nobody's been saved yet. Don't be the old worthless Deku who can't save anyone!
Again, Deku takes everything that happens on the battlefield extremely personally. He feels responsible for saving and protecting everyone, and he blames himself if someone does get hurt, even if it's not really his fault in any way. Deku firmly believes that the One for All quirk is a power meant to save people, and that it must never be used to kill. This is a lesson that Deku learned from All Might, and he sticks to it almost religiously, to the point that multiple individuals, including Gran Torino and the vestiges of the second and third One for All users, actually voiced their concerns over Deku's unwillingness to kill anyone, including the worst villains. Gran Torino straight up tells Deku that you can't save everyone. Sometimes the only way to save someone like Shigaraki is to kill them. That way you are at least saving the world from all the damage that Shigaraki will cause in the future. And in some ways you are saving his own soul from the destructive hell that he has created for himself. If Deku as he is now were ever to become a villain, he would have to abandon this philosophy of trying to save everyone and not wanting to kill anyone, no matter how terrible and dangerous that person might be. So how could this happen? What would have to change to shift Deku's character so dramatically? Well, the change we make to the story will have to be drastic. In this alternate timeline, the Battle of Jakku was far deadlier than it was originally. The villains won decisively, and the Hero Society collapsed even more quickly and drastically than in the original timeline. Gran Torino, Aizawa, and Bakugo were all severely injured during the Battle of Jakku, but they survived. In our timeline, all three of them died. Deku watched it happen, but he couldn't do anything to stop it. For Gran Torino, we can say that he died in the hospital after giving Deku that big speech about sometimes having to kill someone in order to save them. Although these three losses would be deeply traumatizing for Deku, even this wouldn't be enough to completely change his philosophy. That's because even after losing two important mentors and a close childhood friend, he would still have other important people to lean on for support, including his main mentor All Might, his loving mother Inko, his senpai Midoriya, and one of the other students he's really close to, Ochako. I believe that based on everything we've seen so far, Ochako is the main love interest in Deku's life, although she's not the only love interest. But I don't want to get into a shipping war here since that's literally the worst thing about the MHA fandom. If you don't agree with my take that Ochako is Deku's main love interest, that's fine. Just think of her as another close friend that he leans on for support throughout the story. My point here is that all four of these individuals will also have to die. Ochako and Midoriya were at Jakku, so they died on the battlefield. And All Might and Inko are killed in the aftermath of the battle, as the heroes and police immediately collapse and the victorious villains run wild without anyone there to stop them. Deku can't do anything in the days immediately after the battle because of how injured he is, and so when he wakes up in hospital after the Jakku massacre, he learns that many of the people closest to him are dead. Aizawa, Gran Torino, All Might, Bakugo, Midoriya, Ochako, and his mother Inko, they're all gone. along with like thousands of innocent civilians. Deku couldn't save any of them. He failed miserably, and because of his failure, the villains won and thousands of innocent people died, including his loved ones. Now, of course, Deku does have other friends in Class 1A that he is close to, and that he could potentially lean on for support in such a difficult situation. But even in the original timeline, which was far less deadly for Deku's mentors and loved ones, he decided to leave the UA and go off on his own. He was afraid that his presence at UA was putting the other students in danger because the villains are after him and his quirk. So he left and became a vigilante. He spent his time hunting down dangerous villains and trying to locate and lure out Shigaraki and All For One. Now, just imagine how much more determined Deku would be to leave the UA in our much deadlier timeline. Multiple UA students and teachers were already killed by the villains, including some of the students that Deku was closest to. He will now be even more adamant about leaving as quickly as possible, although in this timeline he could not count on All Might for logistical and emotional support as he goes off to hunt down the villains. He will also be much angrier and mentally unstable than in the original timeline. He sees himself as a pathetic failure, someone who isn't worthy of wielding One for All. And yet, he can't even consider giving it to someone else like he did before, because now he knows that only someone who is born quirkless is able to inherit the quirk safely. It's not like there's some overpowered quirkless guy that Deku trusts implicitly just waiting around to become the 10th user, so Deku is stuck. Even though he is miserable and full of despair and regret, he must continue living with the burden of One for All, and he must use it to fight the villains to the best of his ability and to save as many people as possible. The real shift in Deku's character happens during his battle with Muscular, which occurs in chapter 308 of the manga. In the original timeline, Vigilante Deku is still trying to reason with the villains, and he is trying to understand what drives them to do the terrible things that they do. In chapter 308, he asks Muscular directly,
"Why do you rage like this?"
The villain responds by saying,
"I wanna live without regrets."
When Deku asks what regrets he means, Muscular replies,
"Regrets such as not indulging and having fun every chance I get."
Deku says,
"Was there really no other path for you, Goto Imasuji?"
He is still trying to reason with this villain. He's trying to make sense of his actions and come up with a solution that could bring about a peaceful resolution. But Muscular just screams,
"Nope!"
and he attacks Deku.
"You trying to sympathize with me or something? Peddle that crap somewhere else, cause all you'll find in my soul is blood and violence."
Muscular is literally telling Deku that there is no hope of saving him. He is a villain through and through. Someone who just enjoys blood and violence, and who has fun making other people suffer. He likes killing people. He has no regrets about killing Kota's parents, and we all know that if given the chance, he will kill again. Deku knows this as well. In his inner monologue, he says,
"This is someone who has hurt many people. Someone who has killed others. But I at least want to learn what makes him tick deep down."
Again, Deku is trying his best to understand and reason with a brutal and dangerous villain. In the original timeline, Deku manages to defeat Muscular using superior strategy and an assist from Yoshindo, and then he hands the villain over to the police. The police will then use a special supervillain containment device known as the Iron Maiden to effectively detain Muscular despite his superhuman strength. But in our alternate timeline, Deku can't just hand Muscular over to the police. Society has collapsed even faster and to an even greater extent than in the original timeline. Police units have disbanded as everyone either deserted to save themselves or was killed by the victorious villains. Deku can't just hand Muscular off to the cops and move on, but there are many other villain threats out there, so he can't just babysit Muscular either. Remember that in this timeline, Deku is far more disturbed and angry about what happened in Jakku, and he is beginning to seriously doubt the philosophy that everyone can be saved. But even in this timeline, there are some who are trying to help restore order. There are independent militias and brave volunteers who are attempting to keep their neighborhood safe from villains and criminals. Some of these volunteers offer to take possession of the captured Muscular and to either locate an Iron Maiden or find some other way to hold him. Even now, knowing everything he knows about what kind of person Muscular is and what can happen when villains are allowed to run loose, Deku hesitates to permanently eliminate Muscular as a threat. So he agrees to let the volunteers handle him, and he hopes for the best. Now, these volunteers are doing what they can, but they are not expert lawmen, and just as Deku is leaving, there's a problem. The volunteers attempt to move Muscular to a more secure location where escape will be more difficult, but he suddenly shoves one of them and headbutts another. He begins manipulating his muscle fibers until he manages to squirm out of the ropes that were restraining him. Deku hears what's happening and turns around. He tries rushing back, but it's too late. The volunteer who had just been shoved by Muscular gets back up and tries to stop the villain from escaping. But the villain just smiles maniacally, and without a moment's hesitation, he clobbers the volunteer over the head over and over and over again. Deku arrives and uses full cowl shoot style to smash Muscular. The villain is sent flying and he drops to the ground, rolling violently until his body finally comes to a stop nearly 100 meters away. Dust shoots up from the ground where Muscular had landed. Deku rushes over to the volunteer who took the brunt of the villain's attack. He tries to help him, but it's already too late. The brave volunteer who was just trying to keep his neighborhood safe is dead. Multiple powerful blows to the head from a villain as strong and as brutal as Muscular was too much for him to take. As he holds the volunteer's lifeless body in his arms, Deku is a broken man. Despite everything that happened to his loved ones, despite the chaotic collapse of the hero society, he still tried to show mercy to Muscular. And what did he get in return? Another innocent man died right in front of him. If Deku had killed the villain after defeating him, the brave volunteer would be alive, but now he's dead. He's dead because of Muscular. Because Deku chose to show mercy to someone who didn't deserve it. Something inside of Deku finally snaps. His look of agony and despair is replaced by a cold and intense glare as he turns to the spot where Muscular had landed. The villain begins to stand up, and once again, he has no remorse. In fact, he is actually smiling. Muscular has killed again, and that means nothing to him. Deku looks at him and he knows deep within his heart that this villain will kill again, unless Deku stops him once and for all. Deku rushes forward and lunges at Muscular, his eyes burning with pure fury. He unleashes a devastating ultimate move, something similar to the United States of World Smash from the World Heroes Mission movie. He punches and kicks Muscular over and over again until the air around them is thick with dust and debris. There is a crater in the ground beneath Deku's feet. A crater created from the force of Deku's blows as he tore into the villain again and again and again. At the center of the crater lies Muscular, motionless, lifeless. He will never hurt anyone ever again because Muscular is dead. Deku made sure of it. Deku's face is expressionless as he emerges from the crater.
I know the truth now,
he says to himself.
You can't save everyone. Some villains can't be spared because if you spare them, they will turn around and hurt more people. To protect the innocent, these villains have to die. These few rotten apples must be eliminated so that everyone else can live in peace. I didn't want to do this, but I know now that this is the only way. Gran Torino was right. The only way to save some people is by killing them.
From that point onward, Deku adopts a new, darker philosophy. He knows now that trying to save everyone actually leads to more suffering, because showing mercy to evil murderers like Muscular inevitably leads to more victims, not less. While he still shows leniency to petty criminals and villains who actually demonstrate genuine remorse for their crimes, there is no more mercy for the kind of cruel and violent supervillain that Muscular was. Deku kills multiple such villains in the coming days and weeks, and the Japanese public begins to take notice. At a time when the heroes and the police and pretty much everyone else had abandoned them, a dark Avenger emerges to finally give the villains a taste of their own medicine. Both the public and the villains begin to tell mythologized stories about a dark hero who hunts down and kills villains. Deku becomes an urban legend. The public celebrates him and want to follow his lead. He is their only salvation. He is the only one who cares about them and wants to protect them. They start organizing themselves into pro-Deku militias and paramilitary organizations whose only goal is to follow in Deku's footsteps. Meanwhile, the villains and criminals fear Deku and run at the mere mention of his name. To the villains, this ruthless hero with multiple quirks and a willingness to kill becomes a boogeyman. They see his shadow around every corner. They hear his footsteps in every dark alleyway. They are terrified. Along with the public, Deku also finds support among the surviving heroes. Hawks has always known that sometimes a hero has to kill, and when he sees how popular Deku's new philosophy is among the public and how effective he is in bringing back peace and order, Hawks urges the other top heroes, including Endeavor and Best Jeanist, to support Deku. On the other hand, Deku's former classmates like Tsuyu, Ida, Mina, and the rest are deeply disturbed by Deku's transformation, but there just isn't much that they can do. In this alternate timeline, Deku never goes back to the UA. Not only are Bakugo and Ochako not around to help convince him to return, but knowing that they died at the hands of Shigaraki and the League of Villains makes Deku even more determined not to put the other students at risk by returning. Internally, Deku faces some serious challenges. The vestiges of the second and third user are definitely understanding of Deku's new philosophy because they shared a similar philosophy when they were still alive. In times of extreme crisis, like during the age that they lived through and the age that Deku is currently living through, there is no room for showing mercy to those who don't deserve it. But Deku does get some pushback from the other vestiges, including those of Yoichi, Nana, and All Might. And yet, Deku perseveres in his new worldview. All Might believed that a true hero sacrifices his body and even his life for the greater good. But Deku now knows that he must make another important sacrifice. In order to be the kind of hero that the world needs now, he must also sacrifice his own conscience. He doesn't enjoy killing villains. He doesn't take any pleasure in it. On the contrary, he truly wishes that it never came to that. But it did come to that, and he must see it through to the end. Sparing the life of a villain who then goes on to end the lives of many others is not an act of mercy. It is an act of selfishness. By not wanting to become a murderer for the sake of your own conscience and peace of mind, you become an accessory to the murder of so many others. The true hero must sacrifice not only his own body, but even his very soul for the greater good. Let the philosophers debate what is right and what is wrong once peace and order are restored. But now, while war and chaos and suffering are all around him, Deku has to fight fire with fire. Because many of the villains in this alternate timeline are so terrified of Deku, they are much more willing to share important information once they come face to face with him. The UA traitors decide to come clean sooner for fear of what might happen to them if they remain silent. In this alternate timeline, they actually fear the rage of Deku more than they fear All For One, and this encourages them to talk sooner. This has a huge impact on our scenario, because it means that Deku and the heroes are able to lure out the villains more quickly than in the original timeline. All For One doesn't have time to worry about the arrival of Star and Stripe and other convoluted aspects of his master plan because he has to stop Deku now, before Deku turns the entire population of Japan into a massive anti-villain army. And so the final clash between the villains and the remaining heroes happens sooner than in the original timeline. Because of that, Star and Stripe and her squadron are eventually able to join the fight on the side of the heroes. So there you go, Star and Stripe fans, I kept the buff waifu alive. I think I deserve a like and sub on this video just for that. Stain is also eager to support the new Deku, as are many other vigilante types, former heroes, former cops, and regular everyday people who have had enough of the villains. There's also the question of how the Lady Nagant encounter would go in this timeline. Deku's completely different behavior could stop the encounter from happening altogether, or she might still track him down. The new Deku wouldn't jump at the opportunity to risk his life to save Overhaul, so Lady Nagant couldn't play that card against him. But even if she did try to play it, Deku would see that she didn't really aim at Overhaul, and as long as they still got to have a conversation during their fight like they did in the original timeline, I think that Deku would still spare her. She might even join his crusade against the villains when she realizes how committed he is to his vision of justice. After all, this new dark Deku would still be opposed to the kind of corruption and hypocrisy within the hero society that she herself rebelled against. And she also proved herself willing to kill those who were behind all of that evil and corruption. So I think that Lady Nagant could find a lot of common ground with our alternate timeline Deku, just like she did with the Deku in the original timeline. Thanks to Deku's newfound determination to win by any means necessary, and with the help of New Order and all his other new allies like Stain, Deku defeats the villains, and naturally, all the big players are killed without a second thought. All For One, Shigaraki, Dabi, Toga, they're all gone. In terms of Dabi, Endeavor would most likely take responsibility for taking him out like he does in the original timeline, but whether or not Endeavor has it in him to kill his son doesn't really matter because Dabi will be effectively taken out of the game. The League of Villains collapses, which only makes the remaining villains even more terrified that they will become Deku's next victims. If he can take out the legendary All For One and the League of Villains, then what chance do the other villains have of surviving? The remaining villains either surrender to the heroes willingly, or they leave Japan entirely, or they give up all villain activities and assume a very, very low profile in the hopes of slipping under the radar without ending up in prison, or worse. But okay, the villains are defeated, order is restored, and does that mean our scenario ends here? If this really was the end of our scenario, then would Deku even be a villain at all? I mean, sure, he kills villains now, so that would make him a much darker hero than he was before, but that's not the same as being a villain. Maybe you could argue that he's become more of an anti-hero like Stain, someone whose intentions are ultimately good, but who is willing to cross the line into immorality in order to achieve his goals. However, we have to go further. We have to look at the kind of world that the new Deku would create after the fall of the villains. After witnessing the deaths of so many of his loved ones, after living through the complete collapse of the hero society, and after learning from people like Lady Nagant what was really going on behind the scenes the whole time, Deku would come to an important conclusion. It's not enough just to be a hero, or even the strongest hero. All Might was an incredible hero, the symbol of peace, but as soon as he retired, the hero society collapsed. And if Deku just wants to follow in All Might's footsteps and focus only on being a hero while leaving the political and social aspects of the hero society for some random bureaucrats, he will run into the same problem eventually. When he gets older and his body gives out, society will likely collapse again, and thousands of innocent people will die. Thousands of people will lose their loved ones just like he did. And Deku cannot allow that to happen. Not again. And if you're thinking that Deku could potentially just find a worthy successor and transfer One For All onto him when he gets too old, don't bet on it. One For All has become so much stronger since Deku inherited the quirk that it might be impossible for anyone else to inherit it ever again. The insane amount of power that has been stockpiled within One For All by now is probably way too much for any quirkless person's body to handle. Deku's own body barely survived inheriting One For All, and that was before the quirk became much stronger and before the quirks of all the other former users were awakened. So Deku can't just trust One For All onto some successor that he hasn't even met yet, and he can't trust the bureaucrats and politicians to run the Hero Society. We've tried that already, and all we got was corruption, hypocrisy, and eventually collapse. If the new Hero Society is run by more bureaucrats and politicians, their greed and corruption and hypocrisy will get the best of them again, and we'll have a repeat of the tragedy of the past. The only way for Deku to avoid a repeat of the recent tragic fall of the Hero Society is to take control of society for himself, to become the new ruler of Japan. Remember, in our alternate timeline, society collapsed completely after the Battle of Jakku. The police, the military, government institutions, they all crumbled under the weight of the massive villain victory. The people of Japan were on their own, and they were forced to form their own volunteer militias and paramilitary formations in order to protect themselves and their neighborhoods from the rampaging criminals and villains. The only person that all of these people could look to for leadership in these difficult times was the Dark Avenger Deku, the man who gave the villains a taste of their own medicine, the man who permanently eliminated the biggest threats facing the public and sent a strong message to all the other villains and criminals that their behavior will not be tolerated any longer. So, despite his young age, Deku, with his multiple overpowered quirks and his willingness to do what it takes to restore peace, will have a ton of support among the people of Japan. He will easily leverage that support to become the de facto ruler of Japan, with all of the institutions of the new Hero Society under his direct control. Deku doesn't necessarily want this power, he doesn't want this responsibility, but he doesn't have a choice. The old laws and the old society failed to protect the innocent, including Deku's loved ones. If he is a true hero, then Deku must be willing to take responsibility and to take things into his own hands. No one else can be trusted with this grave task. No one else can be trusted to prevent another tragic collapse. Deku must take power, but not for himself, but for the greater good. What's the alternative? Allowing thousands of innocent people to die again on his watch? No, Deku doesn't want the power, but that just means he's exactly the right person to wield it. Those who want power are likely to abuse it for their own selfish interests. Those who don't want it are more likely to be just and selfless, and that is why Deku must be the one to rule. There are multiple ways that he could actually become the ruler of Japan, but realistically, he can just take power directly without even asking anyone's permission. Since Japan is already in a state of absolute chaos without a functioning government to speak of, he can simply mobilize all the pro-Deku volunteers, militias, and paramilitary organizations and reform them into a new police and military. Once he uses these militias to restore order and peace, most people will support him since no one wants a return to chaos. And so Deku could rule freely as a sort of military dictator. This type of thing has happened countless times in the real world, and many famous military dictators got their start in a very similar way. But if Deku wants to gain greater legitimacy for his rule, he could then hold actual elections in the newly restored Hero Society. The elections could be rigged to make Deku the only viable candidate, but honestly, they wouldn't even have to be rigged. Deku is the savior of Japan, the man who restored peace and order and punished the villains who killed thousands of people. He would easily win even a free and fair election. And so, Deku becomes the most powerful man in Japan, the strongest hero, the Dark Avenger, and the ruler of the entire country. But even after all of that, Deku still isn't exactly a villain. I mean, becoming a military dictator isn't exactly a heroic thing to do, but Deku could argue that it was the only way to save Japan from complete destruction. And so everything that he's doing is actually for the greater good. But as the old saying goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we can definitely see how Deku's current position could put him on a slippery slope from heroic ruler to villainous dictator. After all, many real-world dictators started off as liberators or revolutionaries who wanted to help people and save their countries, and then once they got into power, they started abusing it for their own selfish ends. Now, I don't think that Deku would ever use his power to make himself rich or establish a harem of women or anything like that, but as they say, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Deku doesn't have to willingly embrace corruption and greed for his rule to take him into a dark and villainous direction. He just needs to take his own good-intentioned philosophy too far. So, for example, he started out killing only the most dangerous villains who will surely hurt others if he doesn't stop them right now. That doesn't make him a villain, even though it makes him a far darker hero than the idealistic hero that he is in the original timeline. But what if Deku starts seeing less dangerous villains, or less violent criminals, or even political rivals and opponents as a direct threat to his new hero society? In his own mind, Deku could convince himself that any threat to his new society would bring about a repeat of the great tragedy that destroyed the previous hero society. Every threat to him and his power is a direct threat to peace and order, and if allowed to proliferate freely, these threats could lead to the deaths of thousands of innocent people. This kind of thinking is of course a logical fallacy, but many powerful people fell into this trap before, both in the real world and in the world of anime. There are too many examples to even count, but one real-world example that comes to my mind immediately is Vladimir Lenin, the first ruler of Soviet Russia. During a time of revolutionary change directed against the autocratic Russian monarchy, Lenin equated the entire revolutionary movement, which was made up of many different factions, with his own fairly small political faction called the Bolsheviks. He believed that any threat to the Bolsheviks was a threat to the revolution itself, and to all of the values that the revolution represented. Because of this, he justified cracking down on all forms of political opposition to his own party, including fellow left-wing and socialist factions that were fighting for many of the same things that he claimed to be fighting for. An anime example that comes to mind right away is Light Yagami. Now, of course, Light is a very different character from Deku, but even he starts out in a way that most of us can understand and sympathize with. The first people he kills are violent criminals who are in the process of committing heinous crimes, and by killing them, Light actually directly saves their victims. But soon he graduates to killing criminals who were convicted of terrible crimes but don't pose an active threat right now. Then he starts killing even minor criminals, and finally he even starts killing police officers and innocent people whenever he feels that they are getting in his way. Light firmly believes that he is literally saving the world. He is serving the greater good, and so anyone who gets in his way deserves to be eliminated. What's a single innocent life when compared to the greater good of the entire world? This is the type of dangerous logic that Deku could fall victim to. Alternate timeline Deku with absolute power and unprecedented strength due to the ever-growing One for All could fall into a similar trap. He could start justifying a crackdown on political opponents as necessary for the greater good. He could start seeing every criminal, not just major villains, as a dangerous threat to peace and stability. A threat that must be eliminated before it spirals out of control. And that is how Deku could have become a villain if the Battle of Jakku and the events that followed turned out very differently than they did in the original timeline. In the name of causes that are genuinely good, like peace, stability, and saving lives, Deku could start justifying repression and even outright elimination of those who stand in the way of his noble mission. Now, of course, creating a scenario in which an idealistic and altruistic hero like Deku becomes an actual villain is never going to be an easy task. It's all just for fun, and we have to seriously suspend our disbelief. But I hope that you guys enjoyed the journey all the same. What do you think of this scenario? Which parts do you agree with, and which do you disagree with? Let me know down below, and feel free to shoot me some crazy alternate scenarios of your own. Are there any other scenarios you'd like me to cover in the future? Suggestions in the comments are more than welcome. And speaking of comments, can you guess who were my guest voice actors in this video? I will leave the answer down in the pinned comment, so check it out to see if you were right. If you're looking for something to watch next, check out this video where I broke down all 20 Class 1A quirks, including all their latest power-ups and upgrades as of the final arc of the story. Link is in the description and on screen. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, see ya, Space Cowboys.